Well, thanks so much for inviting me to talk to you all today. I am now, I guess, a rising fifth-year student in my PhD program in clinical psychology here at Emory University. I worked with the late Dr. Scott Lilienfeld on most of this research, and I currently work with Dr. Arber Tassimi in the psychology program. So today I'll be discussing looking under the tinfoil hat, elucidating the psychological correlates of conspiratorial ideation. Conspiracy theories are seemingly all around us. In the last year alone, we have witnessed a proliferation of conspiracy theories surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic and even the fundamentals of democracy in America. Conspiracy theories can take many forms, as you can see from this slide, ranging from believing that the earth is flat to believing that airplanes leave behind chemical trails that subject us to mind control. Not only are conspiracy theories diverse, but they are also timely and consequential. As we have seen and unfortunately experienced even the last year alone, conspiracy theories really spur people to take action. And even looking at these photos, you can see protests, demonstrations, billboards, conferences even. So conspiracy theories are impactful. They're not just these ideas that are floating around in society. Even though we might like to believe that conspiracy theories are relevant only to those in the fringes or maybe even the extremes of our society, conspiracy theories are in fact pervasive, and some even argue they're universal. They might be a part of our psychology itself. For instance, over half of surveyed Americans believe in at least one conspiracy theory, and a recent estimate of many different European countries found that over a quarter believed in at least one conspiracy theory. Even seemingly fringe or rare or extreme conspiracy beliefs are still endorsed by hundreds to even thousands of people. So you can see here at the top, the notion that JFK was killed by a conspiracy. Over half of participants surveyed believed in that one, but going down to this red box at the bottom, that lizard human hybrid people secretly control politics. 4% of those surveyed thought that it might be probable, that it's at least partially true. So 4%'s a seemingly small number, but it corresponds to a good chunk of folks still. When we see how pervasive conspiracy theories are, a natural question is, who are these people? And let's take two examples. On the left, we have Edgar Welch. He is a father from North Carolina who one day went into a Washington, D.C. pizza establishment with an assault rifle, aiming to break up a supposed conspiracy. And this is now known as Pizzagate, but him and others believed that elite liberal politicians like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were secretly running a child sex trafficking ring out of the back of this Washington, D.C. pizza establishment. And even though many of us might think of someone like Welch when thinking of a conspiracy theorist, let's also look at this woman on the right. Her name is Valerie Gilbert. She's Harvard educated. She's been an actress, a model, and she lives in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She currently is an active member of QAnon, and she works tirelessly day in and day out on social media, pushing their campaign. On paper, Welch and Gilbert share little to nothing in common, yet they both subscribe to a web of conspiracy theories and act on them in meaningful ways. What makes people turn to conspiracy theories? And what makes different people turn to conspiracy theories? I'll turn to this question in just a moment. Before turning to this question and getting to the data, let's get a sense of what conspiracy theories even are. We use this term in our everyday language, but we need to be on the same page about what I mean when I say conspiracy theory. One commonly used definition is the following. Conspiracy theories refer to causal explanations of events that ascribe blame to a powerful group of individuals, the conspirators, that operate in secret to form hidden plans to benefit themselves and harm the common good. So that's a little bit of a mouthful, so I've emphasized the key points. There's got to be conspirators, they have to operate in secret, and they have to really intend to harm the common good. So really, conspiracy theories are unproven by design, and they're resting on the foundation of nothing is as it seems. There must be something else going on here, and we have to connect the dots. To contextualize this definition, let's think of an all too timely example, vaccine denialism. There are many reasons for people to not want to get vaccinated, and many of these reasons are actually not conspiratorial in nature. For instance, I may believe that vaccines are unnatural and I only want to treat myself via natural means. This does not make me a conspiracy theorist. If, however, I believe that vaccines caused harm, the government was covering for big pharma in secret, and they were intentionally harmful to line the pockets of businessmen, then I would be a conspiracy theorist. So now let's get back to this question I brought up just a minute ago. What are the psychological constructs that give rise to conspiratorial ideation? When we consider how common conspiracy theories are, we want to consider two different questions, the who and the why. And these two questions will be at the heart of my talk today. Turning to the who, much of existing research has focused on personological constructs, so dispositions, spanning pathological and normal range traits. Turning to the why, most research in this domain has examined motivations. What motivates people to latch onto conspiracy theories when other explanations for events in our world exist? These motivations comprise psychological needs that all people really strive to fulfill, but some people strive to fulfill via conspiracy theories. To discuss these two questions today, I'm going to walk through two studies. The first is really focused on the who, so the personological and psychopathological correlates of conspiratorial ideation across 4 different samples. And the second study is one that is currently in progress, and it's a meta-analysis of both the who and the why. So study 1, again, focusing on personological and psychopathological correlates. Let's turn to psychopathology first. So psychopathology really lives in the domain of abnormal psychology. And historically, there's been a huge focus on the intersection between conspiracy theories and abnormal psychological processes. And there's a long and rich history examining these processes. Our lay intuitions also tend to coincide with historical conjecture. When asked to think of the prototypical conspiracy theorist, most of us would describe someone who's lonely, paranoid, maybe eccentric. If you think of this image, the person sitting alone with the red twine, connecting all these different newspaper clippings together, that's what usually comes to mind when we think of a conspiracy theorist. And this goes all the way back to 1964. Hofstadter in 1964 published The Paranoid Style in American Politics, and I've included a few quotes that I think really illuminate that we've considered conspiracy theories to be very abnormal for a lot of history. He talks about angry minds, heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy, animosities and passions of a small minority. So again, abnormal. It's just a small chunk of the population. The paranoid spokesman sees the fate of conspiracy in apocalyptic terms. He traffics in the birth and death of whole worlds, whole political orders, whole systems of human values. And perhaps my favorite, of course the term is pejorative, and it is meant to be. And when burrowing into the data, it does make sense. Certain psychopathological traits or symptoms may make the assimilation and maintenance of conspiracy theories more likely. We're thinking of distress, isolation, just tendencies to maybe have unusual experiences, threat sensitivity, and being overconfident in one's beliefs. Diving into this a bit more specifically, research has examined 5 dimensions of personality disorder traits. So we have negative affect, being anxious, emotionally labile, detachment, withdrawing, avoiding, antagonism, which is being grandiose and manipulative, disinhibition, being impulsive and irresponsible, and psychoticism, having unusual beliefs and experiences. All 5 of these general personality disorder dimensions are positively related to conspiratorial ideation. We also see that measures of internalizing psychopathology, so depression, anxiety, and anger, are also positively related to conspiratorial ideation. So it's not just personality disorders, but it's also this emotional experience, and specifically this negative emotional experience. But negative emotions are not the whole part of the story, as we saw with those personality disorder dimensions. Perhaps surprisingly, narcissism and psychopathy are both personality disorders that are related to conspiratorial ideation. They're characterized by antagonism, disinhibition, and overconfidence, entitlement, and even cruelty. It might be easier to attribute blame to external forces than to self-reflect and think maybe you are causing your own distress. So we have not only history and lay intuitions, but we have research that is suggesting there is an abnormal piece of the pie. But we run into a problem if you remember this image from the beginning of the talk. Conspiracy theories are not all that fringe. They are in fact pretty common. So it's not just a small minority, as Hofstadter originally wrote. Psychopathology thus cannot account for the full portrait of the conspiracy theorist. We need to consider normal range processes in addition to abnormal range processes. And that's where general personality comes into play. If you remember those 5 personality disorder dimensions, they were derived from models of normal range personality. So those were the maladaptive extremes. Now we're in normal range territory. This is the 6-factor model of personality. We have honesty, humility, which is related to being sincere and fair, emotionality and neuroticism, tendencies to be fearful and anxious, extroversion, tendencies to be socially bold and lively, agreeableness, tendencies to be forgiving and gentle, conscientiousness, tendencies to be thoughtful and deliberative, and openness, tendencies to appreciate things like art and be inquisitive. So even though we saw this pretty strong relationship between psychopathology dimensions and conspiratorial ideation, perhaps surprisingly, we're not seeing that much with general personality. So these are 5 of the 6 personality dimensions. Honesty, humility was not included in the study, but you can see the correlations are very small, and actually none of them were statistically significant. So even though conspiracy theories are quite common, previous research looking at general personality hasn't really panned out. And I cannot agree more with this quote based on that meta-analysis. At the moment, it's not completely clear how personality predicts conspiracy belief. There are 2 potential reasons that these relations might be obscure. First, only one published study has looked at that honesty humility dimension. And in contrast with the other 5 dimensions, the relationship was medium and significant. So more honesty, humility, less conspiratorial ideation. That's been neglected in previous research. Second, only dimensional scores have been examined in relation to conspiratorial ideation. And what that means is that all of the different parts of personality are summed together to yield a total score. So you get that total score of openness. But we know that personality traits are multifaceted, and the different facets can yield different relationships with external criteria. So when we lump them all together, we might lose some meaningful information. And no one yet has considered those facets. Let's look at an example. Here we have extroversion. Extroversion comprises 4 different facets. How you feel about yourself, social self-esteem. How bold are you when you enter a room, social boldness. How sociable you are generally, how much you like talking to other people, and liveliness. How enthusiastic and kind of positive are you when you interact with other people? When we look at extroversion, all of those circles are combined together, but it's possible that you might see different relationships with conspiratorial ideation. Maybe it's not about how lively you are, but about how you feel about yourself, social self-esteem. So in the first study, I had 2 aims based on this existing literature. For aim 1, I wanted to examine the relations between multiple indices of psychopathology and conspiratorial ideation to replicate and extend existing research. For my second aim, I wanted to clarify those domain and facet level associations of general personality traits with conspiratorial ideation. And this study was actually the first to look at those facets in relation to conspiratorial ideation. And as I just showed on that previous slide, it really allows for a richer and more fine-grained understanding of the relations between personality and conspiratorial ideation. And I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, but please feel free to stop me along the way if you have questions. Of course, I'm happy to take all questions at the end as well. So we had 4 samples. There's a lot of text on this slide, but it's an overview of those different samples. So we recruited 1 from a college sample, and the other 3 were community samples from Amazon's Mechanical Turk. All of this was online. We had about 300 to 530 participants in each sample. And most of our participants were white, college educated, politically democratic, and female. So our total sample size across all of those 4 was almost 2,000 people. Instead of presenting the results from each sample, I'm going to present the results from across the 4 samples. So we did a mini meta-analysis across all 4 samples. We're going to look at psychopathology first. So here we have narcissism and psychopathy. Narcissism and psychopathy are also multidimensional. In fact, you probably won't find many things in psychology that are not. So I'll walk through each dimension. With narcissism, we have leadership authority, that's tendencies to be bold, entitlement and exploitativeness, and grandiose exhibitionism. All dimensions were positively related and significantly related to conspiratorial ideation. With psychopathy, we have boldness, disinhibition, and meanness. Disinhibition and meanness were positively related to conspiratorial ideation, but boldness was not significantly related to it, which, as we might discuss later, boldness is really extroversion. It's kind of healthy, actually. So it's not too surprising we didn't see that relationship. But in general, narcissism and psychopathy are positively related to conspiratorial ideation. Now we have those general personality disorder dimensions, those 5 that we went over earlier. And consistent with existing research, all 5 predicted conspiratorial ideation. So higher negative affect, more detached, more antagonistic, more disinhibited, and higher tendencies to be eccentric or have odd experiences. And now we have our internalizing aspects. So stepping a little bit out of the personality realm into your emotional experience, depression and anxiety were significant positive correlates. Anger was also a positive correlate, but it wasn't significant. And one potential reason why it wasn't significant was the correlation was very low actually in the college sample, but it was much higher in the community samples. Now let's look at those general personality dimensions. So now we're moving into normal range territory. We have the dimension at the top and the facets underneath. Honesty, humility was a significant negative correlate of conspiratorial ideation. And we saw that fairness and modesty were particularly strong correlates compared with all the other facets. We also saw greed avoidance that was significant, but the effect was small. So really fairness and modesty seemed to be driving this relationship. Turning to emotionality, this is neuroticism. Surprisingly, nothing came out here, not even at the facet level. So it's not just normal experiences of fear or anxiety, but really that abnormal piece that seems to be telling the story, at least with emotionality. With extroversion, at the domain level, there was no relationship. But importantly, social self-esteem was a negative correlate that was significant. So nothing else really came out here but how you feel about yourself socially. With agreeableness, we got that significant negative relationship, and the results were really driven by flexibility and patience. So less flexible and less patient. With conscientiousness, it also was a negative correlate, and most of its facets were significant as well. it seemed that prudence was the largest negative correlate. And this is like tendencies to be practical, tendencies to be thoughtful in one's beliefs. We also saw less diligence and slightly lower organization. Perfectionism didn't really come out here. And I think that's interesting because if you think of that picture of the red twine, they might actually have some perfectionistic tendencies, but other aspects of conscientiousness lower risk for conspiratorial ideation. And finally, we have openness and altruism. So less altruism, and openness really wasn't doing anything here, except again, a facet is telling a story, less inquisitiveness, less kind of curiosity intellectually. So we just went over a lot of correlations and a lot of data. What do we take away? Very broadly, psychopathology traits and features were strong correlates of conspiratorial ideation, but general personality traits tended to be weak correlates. And we did find some evidence that the facets matter. And when we lump them all together, we lose some information. So taking a more fine-grained approach when examining conspiratorial ideation might be really important in future studies. And what we really find is a provisional portrait of the modal conspiracy theorist. We saw low levels of fairness, low modesty, altruism, and humility. We're seeing inflexibility and impatience, less prudence and diligence and inquisitiveness, less social self-esteem. This might be some sort of personological recipe, if you will, for a tendency to impetuously latch on to spurious but confidently held causal narratives that account for one's distress and resentment. It's clear that it's not just one thing that's predicting risk for conspiratorial ideation. As we know, though, it's not just about who we are, but also why are conspiracy theories compelling. There's a diverse range of constructs, more so than I even just went through, that have been studied in relation to conspiratorial ideation. Much of this research has taken place in the last decade or so. So we don't really have a strong sense of the meaningful correlates of conspiratorial ideation, or even how to best unify these constructs in a theoretical framework. So building off of results from the past study and other studies in this literature, the time is really now ripe to synthesize this large and diverse body of literature. And that's where meta-analysis really comes into play. We've already reviewed a good chunk of the who, but I want to bring your attention to other key dispositional constructs in this space. These constructs are really related to that tendency to have abnormal, odd, and eccentric experiences and beliefs. You may remember that dimension of psychoticism from personality disorder literatures, and this is building off of that. And consistent with those relationships, schizotypy or schizotypal personality, paranoia, and broad tendencies to have unusual experiences are all robust, positive correlates of conspiratorial ideation. And if you think back to Hofstadter's essay, he was discussing, in essence, this piece of the pie. He was discussing this like abnormal fringe as he saw it. He even said himself in his paper that he was talking about non-clinical lunatics. That's where these constructs, again, come into play. The other aspect of the who that I want to turn your attention to is physical aggression and hostility. So we saw antagonism as telling the story, low agreeableness, maybe being mean and cruel and manipulative. So previous research has also found that tendencies to be hostile, just generally, and even physically aggressive are correlated with conspiratorial ideation. So we have a lot going on for individual differences. What are people bringing to the table that make them turn to a conspiracy theory? But that why question is also so important. Through elucidating the why of conspiratorial ideation, we can start to flesh out what makes conspiracy theories popular for so many people. And if we can link together the who and the why, we can get that comprehensive understanding of the psychology of conspiratorial ideation. So for the why, we're really talking about motivations. And the motivational account of conspiratorial ideation breaks it down into 3 buckets: epistemic, existential, and social. And I'll walk through each of these in turn. Epistemic motives refer to motives we have from birth. Since infancy, we need to understand our world. And conspiracy theories kind of satisfy or at least appeal to these motives to understand our environment because they provide intuitive explanations for very complicated events. And what we're going to walk through is needs for closure, predictability, and complexity, and how those map onto conspiratorial ideation. Epistemic needs for closure refer to needs to find certainty. None of us really like ambiguity or uncertainty, and we all like to mitigate that as much as possible. So that's what these motives relate to. But of course, people vary in how much they need certainty and how much they need closure. So here again is a list of constructs. I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail because I don't want to overwhelm you. But essentially, all of these constructs relate to whether or not you rely on your intuition, whether you need that certainty, or whether you're taking time to really self-reflect. We have need for closure and intolerance of ambiguity. Those are exactly what they sound like. Here we have reliance on intuition, perhaps my favorite, bullshit receptivity, believing in pseudo-profound statements that are vacuous and meaningless, but they sound really important. Susceptibility to logical fallacies, delusion proneness, we have that reflection piece, and being dogmatic or closed-minded. There's a lot of diversity here, even in these constructs that are lumped together all under one name. With predictability, we again have needs to understand our environment and we want it to be predictable. We want to be able to guess what's coming next. When we over-rely though on intuition with predictability, it can lead to error. And that's what's really been studied in relation to conspiratorial ideation. So detecting patterns in their absence, illusory pattern perception, detecting agency in its absence, and then the tendency to anthropomorphize. These are all positively correlated with conspiratorial ideation. I don't believe I mentioned this with the previous slide, but needs for closure, relying on intuition, and closed-mindedness, those are all positively related to conspiratorial ideation as well. And last but not least, with epistemic motives, we have complexity. So that's desiring something interesting in our environment. If our environment was entirely predictable, we wouldn't go out and navigate it. We wouldn't go out and learn more. We need a little bit of complexity. So needing cognition, needing intellect and simulation, and then intelligence, that ability side of things. And both are negatively related to conspiratorial ideation. And it's not just how we understand our world, but how we feel about our world. And that's where existential motives come into play. Existential threats often pertain to losing personal meaning, confronting information that really challenges our cherished beliefs, and feeling powerless in the face of crisis. Conspiracy theories provide those causal explanations for uncontrollable events. So they're not just causal explanations that are intuitive, but they might provide some sense of control that mitigate these existential threats. So turning to safety-related motives, that threat piece, again, a lot of constructs are on here, but broadly needs for safety are related to conspiratorial ideation. So feeling threatened, anxious, powerless, thinking the world is dangerous, thinking society is breaking down morally, being cynical. All of these are related to conspiratorial ideation. And then wanting control, that certainly is related to threat and safety. And we can break that down into efficacy and personal control. Feeling like you have less control and less efficacy, that's related to conspiratorial ideation. And with our third and last motivational bucket, we have social motives. So again, it's not just how I understand my world or how I feel about my world, but what do my people feel about the world? How do I feel about my in-group? There's a hugely social element to all of our beliefs. Since infancy, we need to feel accepted, we need to trust others, we need self-esteem, and we need status in some way in our groups. And we need to see ourselves positively in that group, and then our in-group as a whole positively. Typically, others, the out-group individuals, are to blame for societal ills. That's how conspiracy theories really work. So they help us feel positive about our in-group while ascribing blame to someone that's outside of our group. In terms of valorizing the self or needing to feel positively about the self, we have healthy self-esteem, then we have narcissism, feeling alienated from others, and feeling like you need to be unique. Healthy self-esteem is negatively related to conspiratorial ideation, whereas needing to be unique and narcissism and feeling alienated from others, those are positive correlates. And we have valorizing the in-group. So again, we just went over, how do I feel about myself socially? What do I need to do to feel positively about my in-group? Again, lots of constructs, because that's the state of the literature. It's all over the place. Lots of things are being looked at. We have collective self-esteem, which is healthy and adaptive, and then we have that maladaptive variant of collective narcissism, feeling social threat, not trusting others, right-wing authoritarianism, so feeling like tradition and hierarchy are more important than change, and social dominance orientation, feeling like hierarchy is necessary in society. All of these are related to conspiratorial ideation, so less trust, more threat, more collective narcissism, more authoritarianism, more dominance. Collective self-esteem, though, is not a predictor. So after going through all of these constructs, there's really just one question. What are the robust psychological correlates of conspiratorial ideation? Do all of these really matter? Different researchers are going off in entirely different directions saying, let's look at this construct, let's look at this construct. And there isn't an integrated account of what matters in this space. And that's what brings me to my second study. Meta-analysis is a very powerful tool for synthesizing large bodies of literature. It allows you to quantitatively estimate what is the relationship between X and Y across this huge body of literature. It also allows us to bring together the who and the why. We can look at them both in the same place and perhaps leverage results to build a more empirically based theoretical framework and start to identify causal mechanisms. All of this research that I'm discussing is correlational. There's very few experimental studies and none that are longitudinal. So we have a sense of what's related to conspiratorial ideation, but we don't really have a sense of what causes it. So a study like this can inform those kind of future research efforts. In this meta-analysis, I looked at 155 studies, 238 samples, over 1,200 different correlations, and over 150,000 participants. To collect this data, I searched electronic databases with a comprehensive list of search terms based on those existing accounts of conspiratorial ideation that I just reviewed. I also looked at moderators, like the type of conspiracy theory assessed, what sample was recruited, age, gender, and nationality. But for the sake of time today, I'm not going over any of those moderators. I'm just going over the main effects. If you have questions about those, I'm happy to answer them. So let's dive into the results. Just like how this was set up in terms of background, there's a lot of constructs here, but I'm going to do the best that I can to collapse across the different constructs and really summarize what's important. Let's look at the who first. We've got our psychopathology domain first. So as you can see, every single correlation was significant and every single correlation was positive, and they generally were medium to large. This is, again, aligning with that story that conspiracy theories are at least partially abnormal. All personality disorder dimensions, tendencies to be odd and unusual and paranoid, being aggressive, and tendencies to be angry and sad and hostile. All of these are predicting conspiratorial ideation. Next, we have our normal range personality traits that we already discussed from study 1. This is aligning with those studies' results. We're not really seeing anything come into play. It's very small. The only thing we're really seeing is that honesty, humility piece. It's medium and negative. What are the takeaways here? Again, all psychopathology constructs are robust correlates of conspiratorial ideation, spanning many different aspects of psychopathology. And general personality wasn't telling a compelling story except for honesty, humility. So people who are socially detached, impulsive, antagonistic, depressed, hostile, aggressive, odd, and low in humility. That probably sounds familiar to what I said from study 1. So we are getting a consistent portrait of the modal conspiracy theorist. This picture, it might be more true than we originally even thought. Let's look at those motivations, the why. Here we have our closure-related constructs. All of them were significant. Most of them were small to medium. What we're seeing is needing closure, needing certainty. That's a positive correlate. Relying on intuition and having unusual thinking styles, those are pretty strong correlates of conspiratorial ideation. And then less open-mindedness, less reflection, and less rationality. Those are predictors of conspiratorial ideation. With predictability and complexity, we're also seeing that all of these are significant. Tendencies to over-rely on predictability, so illusory pattern perception, illusory agency detection, and anthropomorphism, all large positive, medium to large positive correlates. And with complexity, we're seeing less complexity, lower needs for cognition, and lower intelligence. Our takeaways here are that relying on intuitive processes, low rationality, low openness, susceptibility to illusory patterns, and low complexity are predicting conspiratorial ideation. But again, it's not just how we think about the world, but how we feel about it. And with needs for safety, all of these are significant too. And we're seeing higher threat perception, more anxiety, more powerlessness, the world is dangerous, and cynicism. All of these are popping out here. Control, however, wasn't very compelling. Efficacy was not related to conspiratorial ideation across studies, and personal control was only a small negative correlate of conspiratorial ideation, so feeling like you have less control. And the way I put these pieces together is high needs for safety, that's a strong predictor of conspiratorial ideation, but maybe control isn't telling so much of the story. Maybe people who feel like they are in control still turn to conspiracy theories for all of the other reasons we've just discussed. And again, last but not least, we have our social domain. So needs to valorize the self, those were positive correlates except for self-esteem. So healthy self-esteem is actually turning people away from conspiracy theories. But that pathological sense of self-esteem, narcissism, wanting to be unique, feeling misunderstood and alienated, those are our positive correlates. And with valorizing the ingroup, we're similarly seeing that collective self-esteem, that's not really telling a good story here. It's not significant, but the pathological variants of narcissism, authoritarianism, and dominance, threat, those are positive correlates. And what I found interesting here was across all of these different constructs that we've talked about, threat was the strongest positive correlate, social threat, perceiving that your outgroup is out to get you, 0.56, which in the land of psychology, that's a huge correlation. And with trust, that was our largest negative correlate. So distrusting others and simultaneously thinking they're out to get you. Those are our two strongest correlates. And I think this is fascinating for many reasons, but most importantly, it's social. We think of beliefs as these metacognitive things that happen inside of our head, but we really can't neglect the social element of belief. And this is what I just said, so I will skip over that. So across all of those why constructs, what are our takeaways? All motivational domains are important in understanding the psychological nature of conspiracy theories. It would have been lovely if it was just one thing, what a clean story, but it's not. All of those motivational domains were important. There was clear heterogeneity within the motivational domains, however. And this is a classic issue in psychology of lumping versus splitting. So even though all of those domains were important, some of the correlations were like 0.4 and some of the correlations were like 0.1. So some within each domain might be more important than others. So perhaps moving forward, we can't just lump them all together and throw a name on it. Okay, this is all need for closure. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe we need to separate it a little bit more so we can understand even further what matters the most in terms of the psychology of conspiratorial ideation. Very broadly, conspiracy theories are compelling to those who impulsively latch on to beliefs and strive to maintain them, lack the cognitive resources to parse strong from weak evidence, and perceive non-randomness when randomness really exists. To those who feel powerless and distressed, to those who view themselves and their in-groups with undue confidence and view out-groups as threatening and inferior. To go back to the two people I talked about at the beginning of this talk, again, the who for them is probably very different. Their personality traits are probably pretty different. Their education's different, but they're turning to these conspiracy theories for the reasons I just went through, the why. So to start winding down this talk, I want to talk about what we do next. Can we have a comprehensive theoretical account of conspiratorial ideation, or at the very least, its psychology? First, we really need to get a handle on development. We have examined conspiratorial ideation in adults and adults only. Very recently, a study looked at adolescents, 14 and above, and found evidence that they had conspiratorial inclinations as early as 14. I don't know if we can necessarily ask about 9/11 conspiracy theories with children, but we can certainly get at the building blocks, especially building off of the results from a study like this. We know that things like illusory pattern perception predict conspiratorial ideation. Can we start to look at those developmentally, follow people, and understand what causes conspiratorial ideation later in life? Second, we need to understand what's necessary versus sufficient. So even though we have a better lay of the land than we did before, we still don't know what you have to have present in order to be a conspiracy theorist, or what in of itself is sufficient enough to cause conspiratorial ideation. Maybe negative emotionality is necessary, but in of itself, it's probably not just going to cause conspiratorial ideation. And that's where interactions come into play. Maybe it's not one thing at all, as our results are suggesting, but the combination of constructs. So maybe you're high on negative emotionality, but you're also paranoid, or you're also high on social threat. And when those two things interact with each other, you're particularly at risk for something like conspiratorial ideation. And then exactly what the title of this is, of this slide at least, the theory. Can we inform theory? And here's an example, a very brief one, of how we can leverage these results to inform theory. So we know needs for safety. That's important for conspiratorial ideation. We need safety from infancy. That might make some people believe that the world is dangerous. That may make them form goals to preserve safety and watch out for danger, which turns into a conspiracy theory. So we have this normal process from infancy of needing safety. For some people, the world's dangerous and bad, I have to watch out. Now I have a conspiracy theory. And negative emotionality might activate this whole path. It might make it salient for people. I tend to feel emotional, I tend to feel sad or angry or hostile, and now this whole path comes out to play. So if we can look at this from a theoretical perspective, we can really nail down the psychology of conspiratorial ideation. And finally, all of these points are in the service of intervention. The reason we develop theories is not because we just like to hear ourselves talk, as most academics do, but we use theory to make a difference. can we use theory to stop conspiracy theories from spreading on social media, to stop echo chambers like Parler from existing? Conspiracy theories were a huge motivating force for what we saw happen at the Capitol this year. So if we can figure out how to reduce the appeal of conspiracy theories, perhaps we can reduce the likelihood of events like what happened at the Capitol. Thank you so much for inviting me and for your time. I really enjoyed this.
And let them, I would want to be okay. So I want to be, you might add something in there that you want to be especially attentive to anybody that can only make it an 8, because that is the original time when people committed to this, you know, so that it may be that 10 has been already an inconvenience for some people, but barring that, I think
somebody
that
needs to unmute, please. Or somebody needs to mute. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
That's right.
Sorry about that, Shauna.
No, it's okay. I was just wrapping up anyway. Thank you for your time and attention today. I really enjoyed the opportunity. I also want to thank my co-authors and colleagues and my late PhD advisor. All of this research was with him, and I'm grateful to Tom Costello, Winky Ma, and Adele Strother, and my new PhD advisor, Arbor Tassimi, who's really helping me see this through and especially consider that developmental angle. And if you're curious about study 1, that paper is published. It's available. The second study is in prep, so that one's not available yet. And please reach out to me with questions. You can use my Emory email. This is also my Gmail, because sadly, one day my Emory email will not exist anymore. So that's my Gmail, and you can also shoot me a message on Twitter. But thank you again, and I will stop my share.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Remind people of the raise hand feature. We have somebody that put a message in chat about asking how the traits are measured in the sample.
The traits are measured with self-report inventories. So inventories that were developed in previous research, validated and found to be reliable, but they are all self-report measures.
Okay, Ron has a question.
Yes, clearly this is a complicated study with so many aspects. Is there any way to tell the difference between someone who just believes in some conspiracy and someone who picks up a gun and tries to act on it?
I wish I had a good answer for you, because we don't really know how to tell the difference from an empirical standpoint. Studying things like violence or predicting things like violence, it's very hard to do statistically. What I would guess, however, based on existing research in these results, is probably degree of conviction plus some of those who and why characteristics. So if I truly 100% believe that a conspiracy is real, that's kind of my entire life, that's my entire worldview. And if I'm high on hostility, high on aggression, high on negative emotions, I feel like people don't care about me in general, what is there to lose? And I'm right anyway, so I might as well fix the problem. And it's actually pretty eerie and compelling to read quotes from Edgar Welch. He wrote about, it doesn't excuse his actions at all, but he wrote about how he felt like he was actually doing something right. He felt like he was helping children that needed to be saved. He genuinely believed that it was real.
Hi, I've actually got oodles of questions, but I'll just start with one, and I bet others will ask the others I'm thinking of. This is a follow-up to the first question that came off the chat. The nature of the study, as you said, it's a series of questions. The first study you spoke about, dealing with a couple thousand people, a series of questions, and you ask people to self-report. Questions, I mean, are you asking them, are you mean? Are you paranoid? Are you aggressive? Are you, and do they know you're kind of looking for the loony element? I mean, who comes forward to even participate in a study like this?
That's a great question. We recruit generally from the community, and it's not advertised in a particular way. It's just, do you want to answer questions about your personality? So people are very willing to talk about themselves and rate themselves. So that's usually not an issue. But surprisingly, with psychopathology inventories, people are usually pretty honest. There's, of course, some issues about different biases and self-report, but even asking someone, are you a narcissist? Narcissists will say yes, even just to that one question. So a lot of the questions aren't that explicit. So instead of directly asking someone, are you odd? You might ask a question, have people, like, to what extent have people said that you're odd or something like that? So you're not saying I'm odd, but people in my life have definitely given me feedback that I'm odd. Or to what extent do you perceive that people might be out to harm you? So it's not asking, are you paranoid, but it's definitely getting at that.
Yeah, and by the way, with words like paranoid and narcissist, do you use the specialized language, or you avoid that as much as possible? In other words,
on these inventories, it's typically not individual focused. So yes, that like personal focus, I feel like, is less emphasized. It's more about the construct.
The language of that someone who's been to college and been in a psych course would recognize, I would think a lot of the general public, would not. So that's what I was wondering about.
For sure. And I think that could be one potential limitation of studying these things in college samples, especially when you're recruiting from the psychology population. That being said, familiarity probably doesn't interfere as much as we would think with accurate self-reporting.
Okay, thanks. I see other hands up.
Okay, Denise.
Yeah, this was really interesting, and of course, so complicated. But I think you're doing great work.
Thank you.
So, but my question is about how much do you think the current cultural, social, political atmosphere where truth, the idea of truth has been undermined so that everything becomes relative or it's partisan, how much do you think that interplays with the kinds of personal characteristics that you're looking at?
To put it in one word, I think immensely. I think it's sort of like an activating environment. So for people that, again, have some of these traits or motivations, it might not have really gone anywhere in the grand scheme of things in their life. But in this kind of environment, it's like a trigger, perhaps, for those kinds of pathways. Like, now I have people that believe like me. Now there's all this stuff going on in the world. It all makes sense. It's the New World Order, of course. That's what's behind all of this. So I think it definitely plays a role. Partisanship and political ideology, I didn't even get into that in this talk, but that certainly predicts conspiratorial ideation, with some conspiracy theories being more popular on the left and some being more popular on the right. And I think we are in an era of misinformation, and social media allows this information to spread even faster than we ever would have thought. So it's reaching more people than it did in the past. And I think it'll be important to continue studying these traits moving forward, because is it going to matter as much if you don't even know what the truth is anymore? Maybe it's not just about intelligence, but like, how do we even get accurate information out there, if that makes sense?
Totally.
Okay. Alan?
Okay, hi, Shauna.
Hi.
That was all very interesting. And this is sort of following up on the last question, which is that it seems like a lot of the research that's been done and your research where you're kind of doing these meta-analyses is focusing primarily on the sort of individual level characteristics and traits. What we've seen recently, and one of the reasons why there's so much interest in the subject right now, is that beliefs in some of these conspiracy theories have become much more prevalent than we would have expected, or that maybe than we've seen in the past. So particularly recently with QAnon, for example, and now, what I would call the election conspiracy theory, which is closely tied with what happened on January 6th. It seems that in addition to these individual level traits and characteristics, which I think do play a role, that clearly there's something else going on here, which is that we're seeing that there's a very political, an ideological dimension to this. And these are conspiracy theories that are being heavily promoted by leaders, political leaders, and media figures, and particularly by the former president in particular, and a lot of media figures, especially on Fox News and other right-wing media sort of outlets. And so it's being heavily consumed and picked up on one side. So it's not to say there isn't conspiracy thinking on the left, because there clearly is. And in the past, probably, maybe it's even been more prevalent than, or as prevalent as on the right. But right now, it does seem to be very heavily weighted toward one side, and suggests that exposure to these sorts of theories from trusted sources, it seems to be a critical factor. And it is something that could be incorporated in some of these studies. If I was doing a study of this right now, I'd certainly want to include measures of media use, certain kinds of media use, partisanship, ideology, and look at how those interact with some of these individual level traits and characteristics. Social threat, I thought it was very interesting. That turns out to have such a strong, because that is more closely connected, I think, with some of these political and ideological factors. So, but very, very interesting work.
Absolutely, and I totally agree with all of that. Even when looking at the effect sizes across all of these constructs, a lot of them weren't that big. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not important, especially when you consider how relationships play out over time between two constructs. But there is a huge other piece of this that is inherently social or structural or societal or cultural. When messaging from political elites is the very foundation of our democracy is at risk, that's scary for a lot of people, especially if you already buy into that ideology. And I think we saw an interesting example of this in the opposite direction of when Republicans started coming out to say, get the vaccine. Like when Mitch McConnell said, I got the vaccine, you should get the vaccine. That kind of messaging really helps because it's from a trusted source. It's not the other side telling you to do something. So messaging, partisanship, how all of it comes together absolutely plays into how convicted people are with conspiracy theories and what they're even exposed to in the first place. When you turn on Fox versus MSNBC, it's like we're living in two different worlds.
Okay, Bill, I think you're next.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Just to play off the other two, and actually they've answered a lot of my questions you have already. The thing is, what can we do? I'm one that actually does believe that the country is threatened. This, idea of, having an autocrat in office for 4 years, and how many people bought into it against the democratic ideals that I thought we all believed in. Now, obviously, trying to get an alternative message out is probably part of that. But somehow the Democrats, and I hate to just use, maybe I should say the moderate/progressives, have never been able to get the message out as well as the conservatives. Any thoughts about that? I mean, it seems to me that, playing off of my other two colleagues here, that the more that we can do to blunt this idea of lies, which leads to fear, the better off we'd be.
So in terms of what we can do about it, speaking to, again, some of the questions that have been asked earlier, I think reminding people to be accurate. That sounds so simple, but even having people consider accuracy by doing some sort of very basic accuracy rating before engaging social media has proven to be effective. Because on social media, people don't really care about accuracy. They're not thinking about it. It's not even on their radar. It's about validation. How many likes are you getting? What is your tribe saying? So when you remind people like, hey, can you look at this headline and rate how accurate it is? People all of a sudden have accuracy on their mind, and it makes them less likely to share misinformation later. I think also the emotional nature is huge. I'm speaking to the expert on this, Dr. Abramowitz, right now, but we are so partisan and so divided right now. And the language that we use is heavily affective. It's not just, I disagree with you, or this is how we should institute welfare, but you're evil and I hate you for what you believe. And both sides are doing that to some extent. And I think if we can lessen affective polarization and lessen that rhetoric, we're going to see things like conspiracy theories go down. There was a one paper called "Conspiracy Theories Are for Losers," and whatever out group was out politically, it was higher on conspiratorial ideation because they're constantly being barraged with messages that they're the losers, that they suck, that they're evil. And if we talk to each other like that, we are going to feel social threat because the other side is bad, they're immoral, they're not just wrong. So I think we really have to target that emotional piece in our society and make politics as more rational, if we can, more ideological in some ways, and give people the benefit of the doubt wherever possible, because we're actually putting a huge amount of gasoline on the flame.
Okay, Carrie?
Yes, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I was asking basically, is there a more relevant, germane topic given the last 4 years in existence? I don't know if there is, but looking at the idea of self-denial and insecurity as a part of this, particularly someone, a representative can stand up and say, well, on that January the 6th, it was just a normal day at school. You know, people walking in and out, nothing unusual. So that basic, particularly in the terms of harming the public good idea, how someone could come to a denial such as that within the concept of this, you know, of these conspiracy theory ideas would be something to comment on, I think.
I agree. I think you start to form your own sets of facts and your own reality, which is very dangerous. The term that we often use, echo chamber, where you're surrounded by people that parrot what you're saying and no one's disagreeing with you. And conspiracy theories are a particularly pernicious version of that, I think, because they are essentially unfalsifiable. They're based on uncertainty. It's a theory. It's something that you can test sort of, but you really can't disprove it. Not in a way that's convincing to conspiracy theorists, at least. And it's very easy for them to say, well, the reason that you're pushing back on this is because you're a part of the conspiracy theory, you're fake news. It's not just that you're disagreeing with them. So pushback is actually taken as evidence that the conspiracy is actually true because you're fighting so hard to disprove it. So in terms of the capital, like what you're saying with denialism, it's an easy place to get to because you're hearing people that agree with you, and all the people saying that it was a disaster, that it was a tragedy, they're just in on the conspiracy, or they just don't know the truth like you do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Brennan?
Yes, thank you so much, Shauna. A very, very important study. My question is related implicitly or explicitly, actually, probably to social media, but I'm wondering to what extent you could test the presence of conspiracy in context of cognitive overload in relation to less cognitive data coming in. I mean, when I think back, 5 decades, if a person was in a Republican environment, well, everyone knew that all the Democrats were out against them, but then they could kind of localize it, like Democrats are bad because they make farmers kill pigs or something like that. And oh yeah, So you can kind of handle that and yeah, that's a problem, but you kind of go on with life. And so people who were totally against another group within American society were not necessarily conspiratorial. I mean, through most of their cognition and rationality, they're very sensible, rational people. But when you have literally thousands of data that are coming in and are accessible, and you can listen to that, and then is there a way to study cognitive overload in relation to conspiracy theory?
That's such a fascinating question. I could talk about this idea, I think, forever in terms of the 24-hour news cycle that we have now that didn't exist in the same way as in the past. I think in the past we had to trust experts more because we didn't have constant access to information and updates. And now we're getting information and updates so quickly that they're not correct. So it actually is feeding into conspiracy theorizing because it's like, oh, wait, no, sorry, that update was too early. That's not right. It's actually this now. So I think we're being inundated with information, and we can turn to the University of Google to find our answers. We don't actually have to listen to people that have the information. So I think with that cognitive overload, you're relying more on intuition and heuristics, a quick, easy answer. And most data shows people aren't reading anymore. We don't read. We look at pictures, we look at headlines. People don't actually read articles anymore, sad to say. I mean, some people do, obviously, but a lot of people don't, especially when it's shared on social media. They just read the byline and share it. They don't even click on it to open it or look at the source. So it's fast, it's dirty, it's cheap, and that's what's spreading this misinformation. And some research even shows when you have people cognitively slow down, you give them more time, you remind them to consider accuracy, misinformation susceptibility goes down. So lessening that cognitive load and saying, slow your roll, that actually does reduce the spread of misinformation.
Yes, the cognitive load creates a big issue that requires a big answer. And so the conspiracy theory is big enough to handle the big answer to this big issue, where otherwise it's possible to keep it as a kind of smaller issue.
Absolutely. And the bigger the disaster, the bigger the explanation must be, according to how our brain typically works. It's called the proportionality bias. So if when there's big events, there must be a big cause. And like you said, it's not really localized anymore. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then all of a sudden we need this huge explanation for what's going on.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple questions. One popped up in chat from Kurt. He's talking about pushback, attempts to listen and understand are useful interventions, ways to recover if somebody's lost in conspiracy, and then fact-checking efforts appear to push, do they help with the conspiracy? I would remind people to use the raise hand rather than the chat, but I'll go with Kurt's questions.
So for the first question, attempting to listen and understand, is that a useful tool for intervention? Sometimes is the unsatisfying answer. That can backfire because it depends what people's motives are going into the situation. Because I can listen to you and nod and smile, and in my head, I'm building my arsenal to like fight back with you, which is not really the same as deeply listening and understanding. So if we have people perspective take and consider the opposite, that can be effective. But just having people listen, they might just be listening to fight back. So that isn't always effective. Are there ways to recover someone lost in a conspiracy? This is all too relevant, especially with QAnon. People are like losing their family members. And we even see this with cults and other things which are heavily conspiratorial in nature. I don't know how to recover someone lost in a conspiracy theory, to be honest. And I think that's where clinical psychology might be fruitful. We know how to talk to someone who is delusional and psychotic, and I'm not saying these folks are, but that's tricky territory because you can't just say you're wrong that's not going to work. There has to be a very therapeutic way of doing that. And I think we can draw from that literature to talk to these folks that are really enmeshed in a conspiracy, because it's delusional like in nature, because they're so convicted of this reality. And then fact-checking efforts, no, probably not. And the reason is because it depends on the source, I guess, is what I should say. Like if the fact-checking is by your team, they'll probably believe it. But if the fact checking is by, I don't know, Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, you're already starting from a position of animosity. You're the outgroup. So it doesn't matter if it's coming from you because you're already the bad guy.
Okay, Lisa has a question.
Thank you for a lovely talk. That was interesting in many ways. I'm curious about level of education among conspiracy theorists, and whether I know there's always been a sort of anti-intellectual trend among some folks that I would think of as having those traits you mentioned for conspiracy ideation. So I just wondered what's been done in research according to level of education.
Not a whole lot. I know there is one paper that found that education was a negative correlate of conspiratorial ideation. So education did provide some sort of like protective effect against conspiratorial ideation. I'm not entirely optimistic in that regard. I think education certainly helps because it is building up that complexity piece of motivations. Like complexity is not only okay, but it's valued, and uncertainty is okay. So I think that does help. But as we've seen, some of the smartest people in our country believe in conspiracy theories. Education and intelligence are not in of themselves going to protect you from conspiratorial ideation. And in fact, there's some research that shows the more that you know about a topic, the more polarized you can be on it, because you know so much that you can leverage all the facts to your best advantage. So I think education is important, but it's not our save-all.
Thank you.
Okay, Richard.
Hi, I think this was a wonderful discussion of the varieties of conspiracy experience that are out there. And I think there's one element, though, that I'd like to ask you to consider that I think may be a very important part of it. Not the personal reasons why people become conspiracy susceptible, but the reasons why it occurs in society and is such a big problem now. And that is money. There are lots of people, no, I don't know how many, making money off this. And an interesting factoid that appeared a couple of days ago was that I'm trying to trace it through the internet. There are probably 12 major sources of anti-vax type thinking that are spread out and amplified through the media networks. So the fact that there are people out there who have figured out how to exploit this kind of conspiracy susceptibility, I think may be a major issue for why we're dealing with it right now. It's not just the internet, it is, if you'll pardon my saying, a malevolent people who have taken advantage of this and are making a lot of money. So could you comment on that?
Yes. So there is misinformation, which is any information that's false, misleading, or inaccurate. There's also something called disinformation, and disinformation is intentional, false, inaccurate, or misleading information. And people are profiting off of it. And not to sound like a conspiracy theorist myself, but at the risk of doing so, even like mainstream media profits off of it to an extent. People don't watch the news to hear about one car theft or one person that's happy. People want to watch the news to hear about big things. And research on even mainstream media shows that people tune in more and watch more when big things are being talked about over and over and over again. So that can even fuel this fire. But people certainly are profiting off of it. And even looking at social media platforms like Parler, I don't know if you all are familiar with Parler. That was the right-wing kind of oriented social media platform that really contributed to what happened at the Capitol. They made a lot of money off of that. So conspiracy theorizing is not always irrational, especially considering these kinds of mechanisms happening in our society. It's degree of conviction, what you're believing, how impairing it is for you, that I think can really become irrational, if that makes sense.
Okay, Gretchen has her hand up.
Yes, hi, me again. This is a version, a more particularized version of the question Bill Woods was asking about what we can do. Given all you know, and you clearly know so much about all of this, I'm just wondering what advice you would give those of us who on a daily basis, say, are dealing with family and friends who may maintain, a whole variety of crazy beliefs. I mean, July 4th is coming up. I'm thinking of the proverbial Thanksgiving dinner, when you sit down and you've got Uncle Joe on the one hand who thinks the election was stolen, and somebody else who thinks Jews in outer space are starting fires in California, and just the whole range of crazy ideation. And I'm sure you encounter people all the time that have questionable beliefs. What do we do in those? I mean, I find myself getting so angry, as you said, getting so affective, in my language, or wanting to anyway, and repressing that, and just going a little crazy myself. What do we do? And is there any helpful suggestion you can offer for dealing with conversation when you're in a situation like that, as we all are often?
I think the most helpful suggestion I can offer at this point is, again, drawing from like clinical psychology kind of literature, but don't tell them they're wrong as much as you want to, as much as you want to be angry or say like you're wrong and that's not true and that's incorrect. All you're doing is pushing that person farther and farther away, and it's not going to prove useful at all, at least not at the beginning. I think to try and understand where they're coming from and why they have the belief can be important. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them or understand all aspects of it, but when you really sit down and try to understand why someone has this belief, it's usually coming from a place of fear or coming from a place that is somewhat understandable. The origin of it is understandable, even if the belief itself is not. And once you can understand that, I think you can start pulling someone out of it, because you can provide alternative ways to satisfy that motivation, or help them see that uncertainty is a part of life. But it's very tough. It's very tough. It's easier said than done to say, don't get angry and don't tell them they're wrong.
Yeah, and don't get, or anyway, don't show anger myself, I guess. Just get through the damn meal, get through the conversation somehow. What was it we used to avoid? Talk about religion and sex and something else. But anyway, these days you got to avoid talk about so much.
Yes, I know.
Boy. And by the way, a phrase I picked up that I made note of, you talked about how these people tend to lack cognitive resources to parse evidence. Yeah, now I would call that stupid, but see, I shouldn't say such a thing.
Denise, you got a question.
Yeah, so following up on that about the lack of cognitive resources, do you think there's some relationship with what's happened in education, so that as schools have been defunded and there has been a lack of interest on developing critical analysis skills and even civics, but understanding how to analyze information and seek credible sources. Do you think that's played into where we are now?
My intuition would be yes. I don't think our education system does a good job really at all of teaching critical thinking skills. We teach information and crystallized kind of knowledge very well, but how to go about thinking, some of those meta scientific or meta thinking skills, we don't really teach. Like you said, how do you know what strong evidence is? What does that mean? We don't really talk about philosophy. We don't even talk about civics and the structure of our government. We don't talk about how do you interact with your own beliefs as you're gaining all of this crystallized knowledge. Do we hold on to it tightly and dearly forever, or do we have to kind of self-reflect? We don't teach this. And I think that would make a big difference, because a lot of this isn't stemming from lack of knowledge, but lack of how to think deeply and critically about very complicated issues. And I think this is less stemming from education and more from culture and society, at least Western culture and society. But it's okay to say, I don't know. I think we're so focused on having people be right, having people learn everything and become an expert, get a PhD, all of that. I couldn't tell you exactly how global warming works, right? Like, I am not an expert in the physics and the chemistry of global warming. I have huge gaps in my knowledge. I don't know, but that doesn't mean that I can't listen to experts and listen to science and trust authorities. But we really teach people you have to be your own expert, instead of we need to say, I don't know sometimes.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you see in QAnon, when you talk to people, they say, oh, we're doing our research. That's part of what they say they're doing is confirming things, except they sit in the silo where everything is self-reinforcing. So they don't even consider going outside of where they are to get a separate piece of information. And that's what they think passes for research.
Correct, when really the peer review process is about disconfirmation rather than confirmation.
But I had a question. Have you looked at any studies where a group of people of divergent views were brought together and it was attempted to change their thinking about an issue or introduce new information? You mentioned at one point that when you bring up the topic of accuracy as a precondition to answering questions, that seems to have an effect. But are you familiar with any studies where there's really an attempt to look at changing opinions?
It's funny you say that, because we got a Templeton grant last year, essentially to do just that, to the Templeton Foundation. We are hoping to bring together polarized Republicans and Democrats into a room together and have them talk about issues they disagree on, and see, even if they don't change their mind, can they learn something new, even if it's changing one piece of the belief. I don't think, it's realistic to say 2 people talking for 10 minutes will change their entire worldview, but they could learn something they don't know. And I think if our goal is belief change, that's kind of a non-starter. But if our goal is, can people change a little or even add new information to their beliefs, I'm hoping that can be the case.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank you. We'll need a panic button in the room for sure.
we definitely need some way to bring people to a consensus.
Yes, exactly. Even if it's just one small piece of consensus, it's a start for sure.
Okay, Jim.
Could I ask a question? I can't figure out how to lift the blue hand either.
Okay, there's several people. Go ahead, and then I'm going to call on Jim Keller, who's also having problems.
Okay, let me just ask you this question. Do you think part of the problem is there's always a reason for something? That is, there used to be in the law an idea that, it was an act of God. If a tree fell on you, it wasn't somebody's fault. And I think now we live in a world where it's always somebody's fault. And I think that feeds into this kind of conspiracy. You're the the person you voted for didn't win, so it must be that something went wrong, you know, because otherwise he would have won. You know, I think there's always has to be a reason. Do you think that plays into this idea?
Absolutely. I think it's at the bedrock of conspiracy theories, is there has to be something bigger out there and there has to be someone to blame, for sure. And that might have gotten worse in our society over time.
We very much appreciate it and don't want to keep you from your next meeting.
Well, thank you so much.
Feel
Thank
free
you.
to leave. I know some people may want to have a few more minutes to talk.